More about Caroline now as we fast forward to the latter part of the 70s, and for this session your moderator is former Caroline DJ Stephen Bishop.
Oh. More. Do you know, I can't get used to that name again. Johnny Lewis. Anyway, welcome to our panel. We've got here Peter Chicago, there's Cliff Osbourne, Busby, Richard Thompson, Bob Lawrence. You've had as many names as me, haven't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
testing.
And another one, Nigel Harris, Stuart Russell, Marc Jacobs. Then we've got Martin Fisher, Stevie Gordon, and Ad Roberts. So, marvellous. Now, obviously, in this section, we're going to talk about a couple of events that happened to the Mi Amigo, the almost sinking and the sinking. But before then, I want to talk briefly about the Dutch Radio Caroline service and also the format that we had on the Mi Amigo. And we had a format. You see, a lot of people didn't realise this. And maybe, Bob, you could take us through... Sorry, Bob Lawrence.
Sorry, I was just...
Busby, Richard.
Yeah, sorry, I was sleeping, Johnny.
Could you explain a little bit about the... yeah, sorry, I do go on, don't I? The format that we had in the late 70s.
Yeah, well, when I joined in summer of 78, as Stephen just said, so I'm going to do this. Hang on a second. We had... It's not commonly known, but there was a very clever format which was invented. Now, we're not quite sure. Stevie, do you remember who invented that box system? I think it was something to do with Tom Hardy, Mark Lawrence, Kelvin.
Hello? I think it was indeed Tom Hardy who came up with it, yeah.
And it was a very clever system, which is actually still in use on Caroline today. And it was a very clever box system. And I won't bore you too much, but basically it gives the presenter complete freedom whilst maintaining an overall station sound. And I was just sitting down there watching my heroes, Johnny Jason and Andy, and talking about Tony. And these were the guys who I used to listen to. And you probably agree to a certain extent that one of the fabulous things about listening to people like Rob Eden and Graham and Johnny was they all had their own musical personality. Yeah. And I was introduced to a lot of soul music from Tony Allen and Johnny Jason. And the soul music sat perfectly with the stuff that, for example, Mike Hagler would play. But somehow it all managed to sound like Radio Caroline, even though there was different strands and you associated different musics with the individual presenter. The box system was a system designed to maintain an overall station sound, but it gave the presenter the ultimate choice of what he played. So there was something like 5 boxes, A, B, C, D, E. And when you started a show, you would choose whichever box you wanted to. So let's say, for example, you started with box B. Within box B, it might have the first category within that box would be 60s. The next category was 70s. The next category would be current. You would choose which 60s track you played, which 70s. The only stipulation was that when you played a box, you did go through those 3 categories. And what that did was it gave each hour a sound which was separate enough so it didn't all suddenly become 60s blues guitar pieces. There was a nice sprinkling throughout the hour. And it was a fantastic system. And as I say, Cliff still uses that system on Caroline today.
Yeah, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the Caroline philosophy at the moment, Cliff, just before we go on to the Mi Amigo again.
If I can, I haven't got enough to pull, if you'll pardon the expression.
That's all.
I hope we were recording that.
He's given me an extension. There we are. Isn't nature wonderful? Sorry, what was the question?
I've forgotten now. No, a little bit about Caroline's philosophy today.
Is much the same as Bob was just saying. We still use the box system. It's been evolved a little bit. If anything, Caroline today is perhaps not as contemporary as Caroline was in the 1970s, in that I think there's opportunities. Well, there's actually opportunities for a presenter to play up to 5 new tracks an hour if that's how they choose to interpret the box system, or they maybe would play less. But it's the same system. You can pick any box, you go through the box, and the idea, again, as Bob was saying, is to try and give some sort of station sound some sort of overall feel to the thing. And everybody interprets it different. But Caroline today, in terms of that, is no different to Caroline of the 1970s.
Okay, thanks for that. Now then, Ad and Marc, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Dutch service from 79, because it started off in an interesting way, didn't it?
Could you narrow down the question, please?
Right. Talk about the Dutch service.
Tell us. That's the Stephen Bishop we all love.
When you came on Easter, in Easter, 79.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah.
And Tony did the infamous introduction to our Christmas period by wishing everybody a happy Christmas instead of, what was it, Easter? Yeah. Well, a slight slip of the tongue, but considering the conditions we were in, we didn't know we were going to be on air within, I think 3 hours before we sailed off. So, and then it was decided that we needed the Caroline jingles, more or less in the same 3-hour period, which meant that a couple of the Dutch DJs needed to record all the jingles of an album, some Caroline album with jingles on them, and we put them all on cart and worked all through the night, as did Tony. So when we did start off, we were all exhausted more or less, and that's where the Christmas period happened.
And maybe bring Peter in at this point, because this was after the almost sinking, wasn't it, Peter, of January 79? Yeah, it was and it almost sank again. But Peter, maybe you could just talk us through that period, because you went out to the ship after it had been abandoned.
Well, there were so many dramatic events, but towards the end of the Radio Mi Amigo era, we began to realise the ship just was no longer seaworthy. We noticed a lot of water coming into the ship, and the first time we noticed it in the engine room, where the water was up to the plates that you sort of walked upon, but there were bilges below about 1 metre deep, and these had filled up completely with water. And when we pumped the water out, we could hear water splashing, and it turned out there was a hole in the bottom of the ship, probably the thickness of a finger on your hand, and the water was just pouring in under pressure. And of course you could only hear that when the water was pumped low enough that the force of the water projected it, in this case, against an oil tank. And it was in an awkward place, and we at the time concocted a way of plugging the leak by just driving a wooden wedge into the hole, and rather carefully, because we didn't want to sort of drive the wedge and end up with the whole plate collapsing. And we put out a panic call for cement, and we'd build patches around the areas that had developed leaks and fill those patches with concrete. And this began to happen on a more and more regular basis, to a point where we'd always inspect the water level in the bilges every hour or so, really, because these leaks would sometimes appear spontaneously, and just within the period of several hours, the water levels had built up quite quickly. Now, one of the times when the ship was abandoned, the people out on the ship at the time had been unable to start the petrol-operated pumps which we had on the ship. And with the water coming in more and more, of course, they took the decision to leave the ship. I went back out again and was able to get the pump started, and of course we saved the ship. There were a couple of similar occasions when things got on the ship, became so desperate that the crew out there took the prudent decision to leave the ship until engineering backup and emergency supplies could be brought back out there. And sadly, the last years of the Mi Amigo, it was a battle to keep the ship floating. And of course, sadly, that battle was lost. I think it was 1979, was it? Or 1980.
Yeah.
And the thing that we'd always feared would happen, did happen. And we lost the battle. So I think probably that is the kind of event that you're referring to.
And how difficult was it to, after the almost sinking, the January 79, to put the station back on the air? Because, Busby remembered this, and I know that Stevie was there as well. When you went back on the ship and we joined you a few hours later, there was a lot of water on board. The record library got flooded, the studios were flooded. Obviously, there was dampness in the transmitters.
I mean, sadly, over the years, for different reasons, the record library, which was below decks, and it had sort of cabin hatches above it. And whilst we were still off the Dutch coast, there was an occasion where the ship took on so much water, just basically coming in through leaking hatches and coming in perhaps in the bilges, but the whole record library would be flooded. And it wasn't clean water because there was oil in the bilges as well. And all of the records in the record library were all covered in oily water. All the record sleeves, of course, were ruined, and we had to take each and every record, each album from the original covers, and we'd carefully wash them, and we ordered a bulk supply of plain cardboard sleeves. That was an event which was to be repeated several times, because whenever the ship would flood, the record library and all the records were one of the first things which were affected and effectively ruined. So it was certainly a battle. For people that listened to the music and the cheerful chatter coming out of the radio, on board it was often a real struggle and a real battle to keep things happening, and it could be very disheartening. I remember one time we'd gone through a very severe storm. The ship had taken on a lot of water. Some of the DJs had been a bit timid and stayed up in the wheelhouse with life jackets and everything. I sort of went below to the cabin thinking, well, if we go down, we go down. Anyway, we survived the night, and I went down to wake up Dick Palmer, who was, again, he was sleeping in his cabin. The cabin was awash with oily water. His bedside cabinet had moved out into the middle of the room. And I'll remember to my dying day, there was this pair of purple underpants delicately floating on a thick film of oil. And I woke Dick, and he sort of opened his eyes and he looked round, and I can't remember what he said, but you can imagine he was pretty well stunned.
I think if you listen to some of the old air checks or some of the old tapes you might have of the Mi Amigo, if you listen carefully, you can actually hear sometimes when the microphone's on, water rushing, gushing around, and it was like that in the studio sometimes, wasn't it, swashing around. Now then, we've talked about the almost sinking. Stevie was there, and also one of the last voices on Caroline, on the Mi Amigo. Talk us through that night, Stevie.
The last voice, Johnny.
You were the last voice, weren't you? Yeah, the very last, yeah.
Nothing I'd ever thought would happen, but at the beginning of the event, in the middle of the afternoon on the 19th, I was asleep. I can't remember why I was in bed in the middle of the afternoon, but perhaps been up very late the night before or whatever. Anyway, Tom Anderson came into the cabin. Stevie, you've got to get up. He said, we're off the anchor. Oops. Yeah. Well, it's happened before, but it had never happened when I was on the ship, so I got up and went upstairs and looked out the window, and yes, I could see straight away we were off the anchor. The first thing to do was to try and stop the ship drifting, because we could see that was the first thing to do. We had to lower the emergency anchor chain, put that down. Tom Anderson was the brave soul who did that. He went forward alone with an axe to cut the restraining ropes. He cut those and waited for it to move, and it didn't. And he gave the chain a kick, and it didn't. And after a lot of hard work and a lot of struggle and a lot of crossing of fingers that he didn't get swept over the side with it, it did eventually go down and stop the ship. Unfortunately, or maybe not, we'll never know, it stopped us over a sandbank. And at low tide, that was absolutely wonderful, because the ship sat down on the bottom and it was still for the first time in 3 days. And we all had a cup of tea and relaxed. And there was no water in the bottom of the ship, we checked. No worries at all. We were just pleased to not be bobbing up and down in the North Sea. We told the Sheerness, we told the Thames Coast Guard that we were off the anchor. They at first didn't know, but when they looked on their radio, they confirmed we had in fact moved. They told us the Sheerness lifeboat was out, and did we want them to come alongside? We said no, we're okay, thank you. And anyway, they couldn't have come alongside because the water wasn't deep enough, but we could see them about a mile away, just waiting, as it were. In the end, of course, thank God they were there, because we suddenly needed them very quickly. The tide went down about 9 o'clock at night, I suppose, and the ship sat on the bottom. About 3 hours later, it started to float again, and the ship was banging up and down on the seabed. And, well, yes, we could hear a terrible banging noise. It was like 100,000 hammers on the outside of the ship. My personal opinion is that the remainder of the first chain, the one that broke, was trapped between the bottom of the hull and the seabed. And I think that must have punched holes all the way through the hull from one end to the other, because when we were stuck on the bottom, the ship was dry, and 20 minutes later, the water was coming over the bilge plates. Nick Richards, Nigel Harris was there. He started the pumps. Tom Anderson was there as well, working on the pumps. We had a fourth crew member on board, who's now the president of Sky News Radio. He'd been on Caroline, I think, for less than 48 hours. That was his first and only experience of it. But and there was me. I think the breaking point for me was I was on the bridge, intimately talking to the Coast Guard, and I can remember seeing Nick Richards making his way along the deck on the port side of the ship, waist deep in water. Not a wave, but water. And I thought, now it's getting ridiculous, now it's getting near the end. That was the first time it occurred to me we might have to leave the ship. And Tom and Nick, between them, confirmed that it wasn't possible to stop the water coming up, and it was still coming up very quickly. So Nick Richards said to me that he'd go down and turn off the transmitter. I said, okay, I'll go and turn off the studio then and say that we're going off and why. Did that. Tim joined me in the studio, and that was it. And 20 minutes later or so, we were jumping into the lifeboat.
How did you do that? That was quite hairy, wasn't it? I've been reading accounts of that just recently.
It wasn't like getting on the tender. It was a matter of climbing up on the side of the Mi Amigo, up onto the deck rail, holding onto an antenna stay, and waiting for the lifeboat to get near enough, and then jumping across one at a time. In fact, the first person to be rescued was Wilson the Canary. He was past. We couldn't leave him to sink, could we?
He could have flown on the lifeboat, couldn't he?
After that, Ton went over. What was he called? Hans Villan, he was called on the air.
Yeah. What was his real
Hans
name?
Villan is
Don Nothours.
Yeah. He was the last on the ship. He'd only been on less than 2 days, I think. He came out on the Monday. I think the tender was a yacht. It came from Holland, and it was very bad weather. And he came on, and the weather just kept on getting worse until the end. So he didn't have much of a career on.
He didn't know about these beacons.
He didn't know about these beacons that sat on the soil of the sea, and he thought it was quite natural. They sailed past, which of course they couldn't. We were sailing past them, and so he didn't alert anybody. Because that could have sort of stopped the sinking for a bit.
Maybe, perhaps. Who knows?
Yeah. Okay, that's certainly a very hairy time.
You probably remember the coxswain of the lifeboat got their lifeboat's highest award for bravery for saving us. It was a hairy rescue, and thank God he pulled us all off safely.
To get, I was reading the account, to get the four of you off, apparently he made 16 attempts. Actually, to come alongside, 16 attempts all in all.
Well, after Wilson, then Hans Villan went off, then Nick Richards, and there was Tom Anderson and myself standing, waiting for our turn, and the lifeboat came across, and we knew we couldn't both go, and we sort of looked at each other, and I didn't think about it, I just said to Tom, go on then. And that's how I came to it. It wasn't anything planned by me. It was just how it happened. I don't think I would have planned it.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, because we have to move on. Still going to talk to Nigel and Martin. Now, Martin, we know that Peter was, chief transmitter engineer, but you used to cover for Peter occasionally, didn't you?
Get the microphone. Yeah. Yes. We basically worked opposite shifts. I spent my first visit to the Mi Amigo, which was 11 weeks. I think the second half of that 11 weeks I was actually with Peter. Yeah.
Well, maybe Peter or yourself could explain. Somebody was talking to me earlier on today and saying, when occasionally we were listening to Radio Caroline, especially on the 50 kilowatt, every now and again you used to get that hiccup effect where it used to momentarily go off the air.
Yep.
What would actually cause that?
Basically, the 50 kilowatt had a device built into it that measured any reflected power from the aerial, which, if anyone knows about transmitters, it's important that the transmitter is matched into the aerial. If, for instance, when the ship moves, as it would do in a heavy storm, the match is no longer perfect, and there would be a system that detected that and briefly tripped the power off every time the match was not good. And so basically, in a bad storm, you would very often hear the signal briefly cut, and it was just a system to protect the transmitter, really.
What were the main difficulties of broadcasting a radio signal from a ship at sea? You've only got a couple of minutes, by the way.
Pretty obvious, really, isn't it? The difficulties. Well, being at sea, you just it is a very difficult situation in storms, and sometimes getting supplies and everything could just make life very difficult. But we always did our best to remain on the air as much as possible.
Okay, now just to wind up, going to ask Marc about one of your favourite memories from your time on Caroline, or Mi Amigo, it doesn't matter, or both. Yeah, and be careful.
Why? We're amongst friends.
That's true. Yes.
Yeah, right. I think from the make it funny again. No way. No, I think from when I came on board first time in June '76 until I left for the last time in December '79, it was all good memories. One thing I remember, my good friend Ferry Eden, who's sitting over there. I did a show on Mi Amigo called Marc and 16.
He should be up here, actually, shouldn't he?
Yeah,
you want to come up and take a bow? Ferry Eden, come up. Come up.
Here for you. What I did is many times record the program Marc and 16, which I did every day between 12 and 2. Ferry came into the studio after my show, took out the cassette, put on the number 572, which was 572, the number of the shows I made, added, "I hope this is not the last one." I said, "Why?" "I don't know," he said. Just a remark. And the day after, we had to go off the air, 1978, October-ish?
Yeah, October the 20th.
Oh, right.
And there were already severe problems with the generators, as Peter will recall. And things were looking bad. And at a certain moment, we had to close down early, around midnight, start at 7:30 in the morning instead of 6 o'clock. So things were looking bad. And, well, it looked as if Radio Hollandia was going to enter as well. On October the 20th. And that's actually the reason that I wrote down on your cassette, I hope it's not going to be the last one.
And the next day, the generator just collapses. There were so many coincidences.
Yes, it was really
well, you say, this isn't possible. But talking about good memories, I have a very good memory about Ronan. The station went off the air. We stayed on the ship for about a month and then we left. Mi Amigo went on, I think, the year after on its own boat.
Yeah, the Magdalena.
Yeah, and I didn't like to go there. I thought, but it's all right, it's enough. But every fortnight or something, Ronan would call. "Hello, Marc, baby. How are you? You know why I'm calling you?" "No, Ronan, why?" The lady misses you. What's your comment on that, Marc, baby? Well, I'm all right. I've got a job. What kind of job? Do you love that job? The lady misses you. You love that boat. I know you. And he kept on doing that. And the funny thing is, he always sort of inspired people. And he inspired me to go back. And I went back to the ship, I can't remember, 79.
Yeah, well, 79. Yeah.
In May or June or before that, I can't remember. In May? Yeah. All right. Yeah, you were there. Yeah, you must know. You were always there. You lived on that ship. But
born on a ship.
coming back to the boat, I mean, it looked great. It got painted. There were supplies on board because the year before we had really shortage of everything. That lasted for about 2 months. There's no water, no fuel, no ciggies, no booze whatsoever. But we didn't care. No. I mean, we were there. Even last night. I mean, we were all here last night. We talked about the atmosphere on the radio ship, as the Mi Amigo. We felt like family. And leaving the ship would always make me cry. And coming back, I'm going back to my family, my friends.
Back home.
Going back home. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, just before we wind up, Nigel Harris, talking about tenders, I know from your book, Nigel, you've got a story about going out to the ship with Tony Allen.
Oh, God. Many stories about Tony Allen.
Oh, yeah. Got to be brief.
How brief? 2 seconds. I mean, when I first went to... I spent years working for Caroline. As long as the ship was at sea, I seemed to be there or involved in some way. Whether that's a good thing for my career or not, I'll never know. But I remember in the early days, as many did, I met up with presenters in foreign ports. I think this particular one was in Boulogne, and I met Tony. And it wasn't unusual, although I didn't know it at the time, but he had a habit of...
You can tell them.
No, it wasn't that. He touched me.
Well, you're used to that.
You know that thing. We were always also doing news on that boat, and as radio is without any cameras or eyes, shall we tell them what happens when people read news?
Go on, it's all over now anyway.
Well, I think you best do, because this would be a nice little wind-up story, so I know what's coming.
No, that's a pun.
I don't think there's time to tell stories like that. They'd all be lies anyway. I should just point out that Marc Jacobs is a big liar, and any stories that he tells you about us sleeping together is lies, lies, and more lies.
And you enjoyed it.
I think the favourite one with the news was when somebody's reading the news. We used to set fire to it, didn't we? And then have to basically speed up. But in summing up, I think we'd all agree that our time on the ship was very, very special, very precious. And the one thing that I think you see from not only the guys before, the guys from Radio North Sea, etc., that we were all one big family, and that's what basically kept us going, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I didn't get my story out. So
sorry, carry on. No, go on, quick.
You'll have to read it in my book. It's on sale outside.
Oh, yeah, if you want to read the story about Nigel in the book, it's outside. How much is it, Nigel?
No idea.
You see, that's what...
No idea. It's cheap.
Yeah, buy him a beer and he'll be anybody's. Right, thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed that. Well done.
Thank you very much. And gentlemen, if you would like to make your way to that end of the room, get the photograph taken, and as you will all be well aware, there are books and records and things on sale. There's loads of things for you to buy.